Every 4 years, when the Rugby World Cup lights up television screens across the world, millions of people, including plenty of you watching right now, see it for the very first time. 23 grown men, some of the most powerful athletes on the planet, standing in a tight formation, slapping their thighs, bulging their eyes, sticking out their tongues, and chanting words most viewers assume mean something like, "We are going to destroy you." It looks like the most intimidating war ritual ever filmed, and almost everything you think you know about it is wrong. The HAKA you have seen on television is not ancient in the way you think. The words were not written as a war chant aimed at an enemy. The most famous version in the world was composed by a man hiding inside a hole in the ground, and the true story behind it involves a woman whose presence alone was believed powerful enough to stop a search party in its tracks. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you will never watch the All Blacks the same way again. Before we go further, hit subscribe and tap that notification bell, because we are about to go through some of the most surprising, least talked about history most people, including a lot of New Zealanders, have never actually heard explained properly. Let's start with the biggest misunderstanding of all. There is no single dance called the HAKA. HAKA is actually a broad Maori word covering dozens of different ceremonial performances that use the whole body, stamping, chanting, rhythmic movement, and facial expression. Some HAKA were built for the battlefield, some were built to welcome honored guests, some were composed for weddings, some were written specifically to be performed at funerals as a way of honoring the dead. Maori scholars have pushed back for decades against the idea that HAKA is simply the war dance, because that framing erases almost everything else it was ever used for. To understand where it actually comes from, you have to go back to Maori mythology, long before any battle or any rugby field existed. According to tradition, the god of the sun, Tamanui Te Ra, had a son named Tanerore with the summer maiden, Hine Ramati. On hot, still days, the air above the ground appears to shimmer and quiver. Maori tradition holds that this shimmer is Tanerore, dancing. That trembling, quivering movement in the summer heat is considered the origin of HAKA's single most recognizable physical technique, the rapid, vibrating movement of the hands known as wiri. The most iconic gesture in the entire performance did not start as a threat. It started as a description of sunlight on a hot afternoon. Nearly a century before any rugby match ever existed, the first written European account of HAKA comes from 1769. When Joseph Banks, a naturalist who sailed with Captain James Cook on his very first voyage to New Zealand, recorded watching Maori warriors perform what he called the war song and dance. He described contorted limbs, tongues thrust out to an extraordinary length, and eyes widened so far that a full circle of white appeared around the iris. Banks wrote that nothing seemed to be omitted which could render a human shape more frightful and deformed, admitting the performance achieved exactly what it was designed to do, terrify anyone watching. That account, more than 250 years old, is essentially the very first foreign eyewitness description of HAKA ever put to paper. Here is a detail almost nobody outside New Zealand knows. According to Maori oral tradition, the very first HAKA was not performed by warriors preparing for battle at all. It was performed by women, and it was a trick. The story goes that a chief named Tinarau had lent his pet whale to another chief named Kay, so that Kay could travel home safely. Instead, Kay killed and ate the whale. Furious, Tinarau wanted revenge. But there was a problem. Nobody in his group actually knew what Kay looked like. All they knew was that he had crooked, distinctive teeth. So Tinarau sent a group of women to track him down. When they arrived at Kay's village, they were welcomed as guests and given a place to sit among the men, with no obvious way to ask which man was actually Kay. So instead, they performed a dance, deliberately provocative and funny, designed to make the men laugh. One man laughed hard enough to reveal his crooked teeth. That was Kay. He was identified, captured, and killed shortly after. The The very first haka on record was not a war cry aimed at an enemy. It was an act of espionage, performed entirely by women. Now let's get to the haka you have actually seen, called ka mare. This is the chant performed by the All Blacks before most international rugby matches, and it is arguably the most famous piece of indigenous performance on planet Earth. It was composed around 1820 by a Ngati Toa chief named Te Rauparaha, and the real story behind it has almost nothing to do with rugby, war chants, or intimidating an opponent. Te Rauparaha was being hunted. A rival war party had chased him for miles during a violent period known as the Musket Wars, and he had run out of places to hide. He reached the village of an ally named Te Wararangi, who reluctantly agreed to protect him. Te Wararangi hid Te Rauparaha inside an empty kumara pit, an underground storage hole normally used for sweet potatoes, and then had his own wife, a woman named Te Rangikoia, sit directly above the entrance. This was not simply about hiding him physically. In Maori spiritual belief, women carry a sacred and powerful quality known as tapu, and by sitting above the pit, Te Rangikoia's presence was believed to neutralize the tracking incantations being cast by the enemy's priest, a Tahunga, who was actively trying to sense exactly where Te Rauparaha was hiding. As footsteps and chanting closed in above him, Te Rauparaha reportedly whispered to himself over and over, "Ka mate, meaning, "It is death, it is death." Then, as the search party finally moved on, unable to locate him, he changed his words to ka ora, meaning, "It is life, it is life." When he finally climbed out of that pit and back into daylight, he composed the chant on the spot, thanking both the man who sheltered him and the woman whose spiritual presence had saved his life. This is fundamentally a chant about surviving, about gratitude, and about the protective power of a woman. At its true origin, it was never meant as a threat aimed at an opponent at all. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. When European missionaries arrived in New Zealand in the early 1800s, many of them actively tried to destroy the haka altogether. Church leaders like Henry Williams considered it a pagan practice and worked to replace haka and traditional chanting with Christian hymns instead. By 1907, the New Zealand government went even further, passing the Tahunga Suppression Act, a law specifically designed to outlaw traditional Maori spiritual leaders and healers, stripping away entire generations of cultural knowledge in the name of forced assimilation. The haka you see, performed proudly today, survived a deliberate, sustained, government and church-backed campaign to erase it completely. Strangely enough, it was British royalty, not rugby, that first helped rehabilitate haka in the eyes of European settlers. When Prince Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, visited New Zealand in 1869, he was welcomed with a full haka performance, and colonial newspapers at the time described the crowd's reaction with genuine awe. It was not until decades later, during the 1888-89 tour by the New Zealand native football team, that haka was performed on an international rugby field for the very first time. And it was not until the legendary 1905 tour, the very tour that gave New Zealand's team the nickname All Blacks, that ka mate specifically became permanently linked to the national side. Here's a twist almost nobody knows. On that 1905 tour, the team's vice captain, a man named Billy Stead, quietly refused to say Te Rauparaha's actual words. Stead's own tribe had been the victims of brutal raids by Te Rauparaha's people decades earlier. So instead of chanting the real haka, he reportedly muttered, shame on him, under his breath the entire time, hiding a century-old grievance inside New Zealand's most famous ritual, in plain sight, in front of thousands of spectators who had absolutely no idea. Something else rarely explained. The All Blacks are not actually the only Pacific nation with a pre-match challenge like this. Fiji has its own version called the Sibi. Tonga performs the Kalau. Samoa performs the Siva Tau. Each of these comes from a completely different culture and language with its own separate history, yet international commentators often lump all of them together under the single word HAKA, which technically only refers to the Maori tradition. It is a small but telling example of how easily an entire region's distinct cultures get flattened into one recognizable image for a foreign audience. If this is blowing your mind so far, make sure you are subscribed, because we still have not gotten to the throat-slitting controversy that nearly got this dance banned internationally, or the modern political protest that just made history in 2024. Drop a comment telling me which fact has surprised you the most so far, and let's keep going. Something else that will surprise you. The HAKA most people picture, tight, synchronized, terrifying, was not actually performed that way for most of rugby history. Old footage from the 1920s through the 1970s shows the All Blacks performing it almost sloppily, out of sync, and clearly undertrained. It was not until 1986, during a tour of Argentina, that team captain Buck Shelford decided this was not good enough anymore. Working alongside teammate HAKA Reid, who had years of experience in traditional Maori performance, Shelford insisted the whole team learn to do it properly: correct pronunciation, correct posture, correct cultural protocol, or not do it at all. The intense, perfectly synchronized HAKA the world now associates with the All Blacks is essentially a 1980s restoration project. There is even a physiological side to all of this that rarely gets mentioned. Researchers studying group ritual performance have found that HAKA measurably raises heart rate and arousal in performers through synchronized, repetitive physical exertion shared across an entire group at once. In other words, the psychological edge rugby commentators love to talk about is not just folklore. It appears to be a real, physically measurable effect of moving and chanting together in perfect unison seconds before stepping onto the field. In 2005, the All Blacks introduced a second HAKA called Kapa o Pango, composed specifically for the team by Maori carver Derek Lardelli, intended to reflect the modern, multicultural makeup of New Zealand, including its Pacific Island heritage. It ends with performers drawing a thumb sharply across their own throats. To international audiences, this looked exactly like a throat-slitting gesture, and it triggered genuine global outrage. Sports commentators across the United Kingdom and Australia accused the All Blacks of promoting violence on the field. According to Lardelli, the gesture actually represents something completely different, drawing vital life energy called haora into the heart and lungs. It has nothing to do with threatening an opponent's throat at all. But the backlash was serious enough that New Zealand Rugby asked the team to skip the gesture entirely during a 2006 match against Ireland while officials reviewed it. And by 2007, the motion had been modified into a safer-looking arm movement across the chest. Even after decades of public explanation, the controversy still flares up almost every single year. And here is something that sounds almost unbelievable. Someone actually tried to trademark this HAKA. In 2012, after a private company began selling tea towels printed with the words "Te Kamate," the Ngati Toa tribe, direct descendants of Te Rauparaha, applied to legally trademark parts of the chant to stop unauthorized commercial use. That application was ultimately unsuccessful. But in 2014, the New Zealand government passed something called the HAKA Mate Attribution Act, a law that legally requires any commercial use of ka mea to formally credit Te Rauparaha as its original composer. It is one of the only pieces of oral cultural heritage anywhere in the world with its own dedicated act of parliament protecting it. Let's go back to something we touched on earlier, the idea that HAKA is fundamentally a male-only tradition. Historical accounts actually describe Maori women serving as warriors, as political leaders, and specifically as military strategists, with some tribal accounts stating that women were considered the very best war strategists in their entire community. Much of the modern idea that HAKA belongs only to men actually traces back to Victorian-era British colonial values imposed during the 1800s, not to pre-colonial Maori tradition itself. Today, New Zealand's women's rugby team, the Black Ferns, perform their own haka called Ko Uhia Mai, composed specifically for them. And here's a stat almost nobody mentions: the Black Ferns currently hold a higher test match win percentage than the All Blacks themselves. Now for one of the most powerful and least known chapters in Haka history. During World War II, the 28th Maori Battalion became New Zealand's single most highly decorated military unit, fighting across Greece, Crete, North Africa, and Italy. It also suffered the highest casualty rate of any New Zealand battalion in the entire war. Throughout the fighting, soldiers used haka and a marching chant called Ake, Ake, Kia, Kaha'i to maintain morale under brutal conditions, even performing a haka for the King of Greece during their campaign there. One of that battalion's soldiers, 2nd Lieutenant Te Moana Nui Akiwa Ngarimu, was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest and most prestigious award for bravery in the entire British honor system, making him the first Maori ever to receive it. Scholarships carrying his name still fund Maori students across New Zealand today, a direct line running from one act of wartime courage to modern education nearly 80 years later. That phrase, Kia Kaha, meaning stay strong, came directly out of that battalion's wartime legacy, and it has since become one of New Zealand's most recognized phrases of national resilience. It was spoken publicly by Prince William at a memorial following the deadly 2011 Christchurch earthquake, and again by members of the British royal family after the tragic 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings. A phrase born out of Maori soldiers surviving some of the worst fighting of the 20th century is now something an entire country reaches for in moments of collective grief. This history is not locked away safely in the past either. In November of 2024, a 22-year-old Maori member of parliament named Hana Rohiti Maipi Clark stood up during a vote on a controversial bill that critics said would strip away Indigenous land and cultural rights. She tore up a copy of the bill and led a haka directly on the floor of Parliament, joined almost instantly by other lawmakers and members of the public gallery, forcing the Speaker to suspend the entire session. The fallout was historic. She was suspended for 7 days, and her party's co-leaders were banned for 21 days each, the longest suspensions ever handed down in that parliament's history. Video of the protest went viral around the world within hours, turning an ancient chant into one of the most talked about acts of modern political resistance anywhere on Earth. And here's the twist you probably did not expect: haka is already quietly part of American culture. Several American high school football teams perform haka before games, a tradition that reportedly began at Kahuku High School in Hawaii, home to a large Maori, Samoan, and Tongan community. Even NBA fans have unknowingly brushed up against this history during the 2019 to 2020 NBA season restart. Oklahoma City Thunder center Steven Adams, who is part Maori himself, wore the words Kia Kaha on the back of his own jersey for the entire world to see. So the next time you watch the All Blacks stomp, slap their chests, and stare down an opponent before kickoff, you will know exactly what is actually happening. You are not watching a simple war cry. You are watching the survival story of a man hidden inside a holes in the ground, saved by a woman's spiritual power. You are watching a tradition that missionaries and colonial law tried to erase and failed. You are watching something that carried soldiers through the worst battles of World War II, and something that shut down a national parliament less than 2 years ago. If this video changed the way you see the haka, do me a favor, hit subscribe, leave a comment with the fact that shocked you the most, and share this with someone who still thinks it is just an intimidation dance. History like this rarely gets taught properly outside the country it comes from, which is exactly why so much of it stays forgotten, misunderstood, or reduced to a single sporting cliché on television. There is a lot more forgotten history, exactly like this, waiting to be uncovered, and I do not want you to miss the next one, so make sure you are subscribed before you go.